Welcome to the Moxie OT podcast, where we invite occupational therapy practitioners, consumers, and friends of OT to talk about evidence-based practice. Today we'll be talking to Eileen Brodecki about the cognitive orientation to daily occupational performance or co-op approach. This metacognitive strategy training approach is client-centered and provides evidence of clients achieving not only their goals, but improving their problem-solving skills. Let's meet Eileen. Today on the Moxie OT podcast, we're going to be talking with Eileen Brodecki. She's joined us here today to talk about the cognitive orientation to daily occupational performance or co-op approach. I asked Eileen to join me because she's an expert in this approach. We've worked together on a research study using this approach. We've worked together in a setting called day rehab. Eileen, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
For sure. Thank you again so much for inviting me on, Sarah. I'm really excited to talk about this. So right now, I'm an occupational therapist. I work at the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. I've been working there for the last 7 years. And I work in a level of care called day rehab, which is a very unique level of care. We see patients after they've left their acute inpatient rehab stay in the hospital, and all of our patients are living at home. So the goals and the things that we're working on in occupational therapy tend to be very function-based and activity-based to help them live and perform the things that they need to do, want to do, and are expected to do in the most independent way possible.
I'm such a fan of day rehab, as you know. So, and you use the co-op approach in day rehab, right? Can you tell us a little bit about how, I've tried to use it in day rehab and it was very challenging because it's a very dynamic setting. So tell us a little bit about using it in day rehab, I guess.
Sure. So it can be really challenging to use the co-op approach in day rehab because it is such a unique level of care. It's also a group model based. So, we expect that some of our patients will be grouped. So there is that pressure for those one-on-one sessions of prioritizing what the goals are going to be. I think one of the the thing that I value from co-op is that, we're using patient-driven goals in the approach. So once you get the buy-in from the patient, I think it tends to be a much easier approach to use, as well as, kind of learning the approach, then applying it to other goals and things like that, and giving them homework is super helpful for the patient. But it is challenging, and I've found the more I kind of force myself to use co-op with patients, the easier it gets to help guide them with the approach itself.
I think that's so true. Like as therapists, we want to do everything right for our clients. And sometimes we just need to let ourselves be a little bit uncomfortable and maybe not do something perfect the first time. And the more that we use an unfamiliar approach, the better we'll get at it, and the better we'll to guide our clients through a new approach. Why don't could you give our clients, our listeners, a quick explanation of exactly what is the co-op approach?
Yeah, so the co-op approach really is meant to be it's a metacognitive strategy training technique, I think is the technical definition, but really helping our clients be able to observe and assess their own behaviors, and then being able to alter their performance so that they can complete the goals that they want to do. So we do this by first identifying and kind of prioritizing what those goal areas are. That's the first step, goal, and then creating a plan, then doing it. And then I think, Sarah, as you said, the most important piece of it is the check. So figuring out how and if they achieved their goal. And then kind of going through that process with them of goal, plan, do, check. You're able to, kind of I lost it. You're able to, with your patient, work with them once they've identified their goals to create a plan and then to formulate a check so that when they do it, they can know whether or not they've achieved their goal.
Yeah, and the great thing about co-op, is you and I know, is that it's all right if their plan didn't work the first time, right? Because they have that check and they just create a new plan the next time.
Exactly. And that's some of the feedback that we've gotten from the participants that we've had, how helpful it was to know that, you could just revise your plan. It was okay if you didn't meet your goal, you could find a way, a different way or an alternative way by problem solving what you could change in your plan in order to achieve that goal, which I think is really valuable.
It was really valuable, and it really, in such a goal-oriented world, it really was some really special feedback that we heard.
Absolutely.
Um, are there any specific tools that you use to help your clients identify their goals?
Definitely. So I think that this starts day one, but it's kind of an ongoing, evolving process of like formulating what that occupational profile is for your patient. So that starts day one, asking them, what are the things that you need to do, you want to do, and are expected to do. What are the priority areas that your clients would like to, work on in therapy? And a lot of times, what I find in the occupational profile initially is we start to talk about impairment-based deficits. My arm doesn't work, or I can't walk where I want to walk, or I can't walk well, I should say. And then I always try and spin it when I get the occupational profile of saying, okay, so maybe that left arm doesn't work as well. What do you need to do with that arm so that you're able to be more independent? Or, you want to walk, well, where do you want to go? Do you want to go to the grocery store? Do you need to be able to get upstairs to use the bathroom? So kind of starting at least day one to switch from an impairment focus, which we tend to see in the medical and hospital community and environment, to more activity-based. So that's kind of the informal way, I guess I would start identifying those things, but using tools like the COPM, or the Canadian Occupational Performance Measure, is a way to help kind of quantify and put some numbers on, the different goal areas, whether it's productivity, self-care, or leisure. Kind of those are the three categories the COPM looks at. And then prioritizing, maybe the 4 or 5 top goal areas they want to work on. That's where your client would also rate their performance on a scale of 1 to 10, and then their satisfaction with that performance on a scale of 1 to 10. So those are really the 2 areas are my go-to areas as far as for developing the goals and the things that we're working on for the co-op strategy.
That's so great. I think that it can be really hard when you hear the client say, like, I just have to be able to walk and then everything will be fine. But learning kind of those interview skills to help them sort of flip the switch to a more occupation centered way of thinking is a skill to learn.
It is. And I think sometimes, I find myself kind of, prioritizing maybe more impairment based things. And I have to kind of cue myself sometimes too, to be like, hold on a second, like I'm doing occupational therapy. What's the purpose of, doing this e-stim or whatever, where I'm doing with the client? How am I tying that back to the occupation?
Right.
I'm really passionate about that. I want to make sure that I am doing that.
And I think all the evidence that we're seeing in studies with the co-op approach show that the more we do occupation, the better outcomes we have with our clients. So that's why we're here at Moxie OT to talk about these things.
Yes.
Another thing I wanted to point out is that the Canadian Occupational Performance Measure is also an outcome measure. So I think that's really helpful because you can, after you've done your intervention, whether it's co-op or, more traditional occupational therapy, you can check in with your client again and see if if they feel they've improved with their performance and their satisfaction. And that's really nice when you're dealing with things like insurance companies and really needing to demonstrate that progress.
Absolutely. And I think too, sometimes, what I've seen with the COPM, it helps improve that insight that the client has after some occupational therapy has occurred. I've gone and sometimes have reassessed with people their COPM. They're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I rated myself this on day one. That was really, I wasn't there, but I'm here now. So I think it's a really great tool that kind of helps bring the patient to be part of the team and be a more active player in their rehabilitation. It's a great measure.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on the insight, and there's some good evidence to demonstrate that too. And that's a little frustrating sometimes as a clinician, because then those are the times when you're not demonstrating the same level of progress through that measure, but you've developed that insight, which is an important factor for moving forward. So,
Absolutely.
what are some of the goals your patients have chosen to work with you through the COPM and on the co-op approach?
So there have been so many different goals, and some goals that, I think I had to make sure that, you didn't have that bias that like maybe that wasn't a good goal to work on for the approach. So for example, one of the goals that I was kind of like, how is that going to work, was being able to hang out with her friends. That was a goal that we worked on and we're able to kind of break down and actually achieve at the end of the day, which was awesome. Just this week, I was working with somebody, and again, it was like a big overarching goal of like, I want to take control of my health. How are we going to do that? So we got to the point and we were able to kind of figure out, the goal was he wanted to be able to make dinner for his mother. And then we made the plan for that. And then his check was that she said that she enjoyed the food. So the goals that you can work on, and then the goals can be really simple. Like, I want to be able to shower by myself, right? So it can be applied, I think, with practice and technique of how to guide your patients through guided discovery, right? So kind of showing, not telling them, and letting them come to their own conclusions to kind of achieve these goals. But the goals could really be anything. I've seen high level and low level goals for sure.
Wow, that's really incredible. What a vast variety of goals that you can work on with the approach. But working on goals like taking control of your health or hanging out with your friends in the traditional rehab setting, you are an outpatient, so I think that is a little bit different than being an inpatient and having the constraints of being inside the building as much. But still, you have the constrictions of, an hour-long treatment session. So what are some of the ways that you bridge that gap?
Yeah, so I think one of the ways of bridging that gap is kind of having and making sure that this is a goal that the patient wants to do, but some accountability or outside work. Maybe the plan and the goal is what happens in therapy, but the do, and then, I mean, maybe the check too in therapy, but the do is outside of therapy, right? So I think having, some physical paper, I think is helpful, because then you like it was like, this is your homework to that patient, and handing it to them, and then making sure that you're following up and making sure to be like, hey, did it work? How did your check go? Even if you don't see them, that next session they have of OT, stop them in the hall, like just making sure that you're going back and actually bringing that accountability fact, I think, comes through. I think the other thing that's challenging from an outpatient perspective is, when you hear things like leisure or hanging out with your friends, like that's not, a medically necessary sort of thing. So that can be kind of tricky in documentation in trying to value that really occupation-based goal. But then maybe even talking about how the transfer to maybe a more functional task or an IADL goal or something like that, I think is important to keep in mind. We can't, as much as I would like to bill on leisure and meaningful things, insurance doesn't really care about those things as much.
Yeah, we definitely have those just clinical realities, especially I think as OTs treating in the United States. Um, but not that we want to be too creative in our writing, but I think that we can definitely the cool thing about co-op is that it's about translating the ability to use this problem solving approach to other goals. So I think you're absolutely right talking about how they're going to translate um, this this approach to other goals is the perfect way to handle that. Um, and I, I think when I started using the co-op approach, I was maybe a little uncomfortable with how much we were just talking in therapy, but recognizing how much more they're doing outside of therapy because they're sent home with that homework is so cool. Like, um, Eileen and I had a client who suddenly was like taking the bus to go shopping and doing all of these things that I don't think she would have been doing had she not been sent home with so much homework. So,
I totally agree with you. I think it surprises me sometimes in the approach where I'm like, maybe we worked on it for one goal and then we've switched to focus to other areas. And then people coming and saying like, hey, I made this plan, it didn't work. So I think that when you get the buy-in and I've seen patients be able to kind of generalize and transfer that skill to other occupations or meaningful things for them. And I think health management, taking care of yourself, that's a huge thing that we definitely can as OTs work on and with our clients. So I think at the end of the day, it's a really the co-op can help with a lot of that for some of these patients.
yeah, I think that's super cool because I think as OTs often we know we should have a role in health management, but maybe outside of like medication management, we're not really sure how to make that a real occupation based approach. Like we don't want to just sit down and provide nutrition education. So recognizing that we could use co-op for that health management of goal is awesome. Um, I think I have this question written down, but I think we've kind of touched on a lot of this. But what are reasons why OTs would want to use the co-op approach versus more of a traditional OT approach that we might think about as like direct skills training or where we kind of provide that strategy for the client, right? Like, okay, you're not cooking healthy meals. Let's write down 3 healthy meals you can make this week and just kind of provide those strategies for them.
Yeah, I think we definitely have touched on it. But I think, by instead of doing, and for some patients, that direct skills training is what they need, right? But I think that a lot of the patients, at least that I see in day rehab, tend to have, kind of mild to moderate cognitive impairments. I think that the co-op approach works best for those patients. And I think the biggest reason why I'd say is just that client buy-in, like you're actually using the things that they want to do versus the things that maybe you want to do. And sometimes, not even sometimes, I've tried to use the co-op strategy with things that I want them to do, and it doesn't work very well because there's not that intrinsic motivational factor with it. And I think that that's something that I had to kind of learn. It was like, oh, you need to be able to shower, let's go ahead and do a co-op about showering. And then it's like, they don't really care. They're like, okay, getting help in the shower. So I think that it's a powerful thing when you see a patient who's achieved something that's really important to them and you kind of helped get them there. I think that that's something that's the reason why I became an OT. So when I get to see that, I think that's what makes me continue to use co-op as an approach with my patients.
Yeah, I think it's definitely all about that intrinsic drive. When I always think about how like if your mom tells you what to do, all right, you might do it one time, but you're probably not going to keep your room clean or whatever. But when it's something that's really valuable to you, or you come up with the strategy yourself, then you own it. So, you'll keep your room clean because pick up every night because you chose that strategy or whatever.
Right.
It's awesome. Can you tell me about a particular success story that you had with a client?
Oh, sure, definitely. I think one of and actually this is a client I'm continuing to see, and she was part of one of our co-op groups that we had run. And she continues to use Goal Plan Do Check in everything that she's doing. Her goal was to be able to stand in the kitchen for cooking. And now she's, making meals for her family, and she's cooking she just cooked brownies yesterday in the clinic, like by herself, stood the whole time without a rest break, but still incorporating those, okay, here's my goal. This is the plan I'm going to have. And this is the check. Like, she'll go and she'll actually say those things to the other therapists that didn't even really work with her in the co-op approach. So that's someone who's really kind of, I think, harnessed and bought in to those strategies, and is able to apply them to other, barriers to her performance and being able to do the things that she wants to do. I mean, she's working part-time right now as well. So she kind of has to, I think, kind of prioritize and plan. And I think, had we not maybe used the co-op approach, I don't know how successful she might have been. I mean, I'm sure she would have figured it out, but it's just been such a good success story to see how well she's doing right now. She still has a long way to go, but she's really, really doing well. And it's been great to see her.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, at the Moxie OT podcast, we want to make sure we provide an opportunity for our listeners to increase their Moxie. So if an OT practitioner wanted to get started using the co-op approach, what might you recommend to them?
Well, to get started, I would definitely kind of familiarize yourself with the COPM, or just how to get a really good occupational profile. Because if you don't have that, I don't think the co-op approach is going to be very helpful. And then I think something that I've done as a clinician is, looking at the research, what's out there, how has it been used before, and, looking to see what's on. I think AOTA has some information, on the co-op approach as well. Sarah, what would you suggest?
Yeah, I think those are all great ideas. I think I'll provide some links for folks on the website too. I think the co-op book, both the first one that kind of lays out the whole approach for you, and the new book that provides a lot of the latest evidence, are really helpful as well.
Awesome.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Eileen. It's been a lot of fun talking to you about my favorite approach.
Yeah, thank you so much. And if anybody ever had any questions or anything like that, feel free. We can put my contact info. I'd be happy to talk about it with anybody if they have any questions, or how I carried it out in day rehab itself.
Great. We'll put your email up on the Moxie OT website.
Perfect. Thanks so much
Take
for
care.
having me, Sarah.
Thanks for joining us for that great conversation with Eileen Brodecki on the co-op approach. As Eileen discussed, there's a great amount of evidence for this approach with adults. Dr. Skidmore has found that if you use this approach and focus just on the client's identified goals, they'll not only make progress in those goals, they'll also make progress in their activities of daily living. She's also found that these patients continue to make progress over time after being discharged from inpatient rehab, while patients treated with a more traditional approach actually decline after being discharged from inpatient rehab. I find this article absolutely fascinating. A great way to learn how to provide the co-op approach is to read the book. Dr. Polentenko authored the approach and does a great job explaining how to provide the approach step by step in her book, Enabling Occupation in Children. This is how I learned to apply the co-op approach. This book is focused on the pediatric population, but as you heard today, the approach works great with adults as well. The latest and greatest book on the co-op approach is Cognitive Orientation to Daily Occupational Performance in OT. This book provides updated information on the many different populations the approach has been used with. As Eileen mentioned, the COPM is an excellent tool for building your occupational profile and garnering occupation-based goals. We'll provide links to all of these resources on the Moxie OT website. If you want to be a part of the conversation, leave us your email address at moxieot.com. We're also on all of your favorite social media channels. The Moxie OT podcast was recorded in our home in the Avondale neighborhood of Chicago. This episode was produced by Brian Zira. Our intro music is courtesy of 13 Tacos Studio. Technical assistance provided by our dog Grody. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.